So, good evening, Rotarians and colleagues in peace. I'm Jim Halderman, the chair of our District 5450 Peace Committee, sponsor of the Forum for Discussion. It truly is exciting to introduce Christine Ahn for this presentation. A few of us had the great pleasure listening to her amaze the audience 3 years ago at the International Peace Conference in California. It's people like Christine that brings hope to possibilities in our work for peace. She will, I know, inspire us, teach us, and encourage us to continue our efforts and bring peace to all. Christine, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Jim. And it's so great to see so many familiar faces. Hi, Richard, Linda, and all of you for joining tonight. I'm calling in from Honolulu, Hawaii, where I now live and have lived for the past decade. But I consider Boulder, Colorado, my second home, or actually third home after the Bay Area. I'm actually a graduate from CU Boulder. I was part of the Invest social change program in the early years. And I used to go to the Rocky Mountain Peace Center because I used to be part of the co-op, and we used to bag beans and all sorts of things. So yes. I have a very soft part in my heart for Colorado and Coloradans. And I have to say, just seeing all of you join today and knowing it's not, the Margaret Mead quote comes to mind. It's never just like we should never expect masses, but a really dedicated group of activists and individuals working together to achieve change in the world. And I kind of am feeling the possibility with this small but mighty group to really push us across the finish line in Colorado regarding a bill that we've been working very hard to try to envision its passage. And so thank you all for joining tonight. I know it's almost the end of the week, and so I'll try to keep it brief but substantive. I want to start by saying that the situation on the Korean Peninsula is very dire. It is perhaps as dangerous as in the time of Fire and Fury, except it's made worsened by the fact that we've had 3 years of a pandemic. North Korea has been almost completely sealed off from the rest of the world. We have just completed massive US South Korea military exercises, including the US sent 2 nuclear submarines to the Korean Peninsula. And Biden is heralding the success of a trilateral summit at Camp David between South Korea, Japan, and the US. But that is very much pushing a new axis between North Korea, China, and Russia. And so as we face the world's greatest threat to humanity, the climate crisis, let's not forget that July was the hottest month ever since the World Meteorological Association has been gathering data since 1940. And instead of fighting climate, we have drawn new geopolitical fault lines in a new Cold War, whether it's the Russia-Ukraine war and now between the US and China. And so I present this by providing that context in which the Korean Peninsula is struggling to find its way in this new Cold War. So I'm the founder and executive director of an organization called Women Cross DMZ. And so I'm just going to take hopefully not more than 15 to 20 minutes to just go through a presentation about our work as a grassroots women-led, largely women-led, but obviously we can't just organize women, we need to organize everybody across gender to achieve an end to a 70-year-old conflict. So without further ado, I'm just going to start my presentation. And please, let's see, here we go. And view full screen. Okay, Jim, we're still good. You can see the presentation?
We're good, yes.
Okay, thanks so much. So this is an image of us as we crossed the DMZ from North to South Korea in 2015, which was the 70th anniversary of Korea's division by the United States and the former Soviet Union. The Korean War, which lasted for 3 years, claimed more than 4 million lives, and actually 3.5 million Korean lives. Samuel Moyn, who is the historian at Yale, says that the Korean War, even though it was just 3 years, it was the most brutal war of the 20th century, measured by the intensity of violence and per capita civilian deaths. It finally came to a temporary end in 1953, which was 70 years ago on July 27th, when North Korean and US commanders signed the armistice agreement. And they promised in that agreement to return within 90 days to negotiate a permanent settlement. And that has never happened. And so, knowing that this war has gone on for 7 decades and has impacted 3 to 4 generations of Korean families, we decided in 2015 that we needed to take action. We need to, as Gloria Steinem would say, we need to do with our bodies what we hope our political leaders would do, which was we needed to take action. We needed to walk and cross this demilitarized zone that has separated the Korean people and has kept the Korean Peninsula in a perpetual state of war. And so we organized women's peace symposiums in both Pyongyang, and then when we crossed the DMZ, we also did it in Seoul. We met with over 250 women, North Korean women, at this symposium in Pyongyang, and here are images of them. And we also walked with 10,000 Korean women on both sides of the DMZ, 5,000 women in Pyongyang. The image on the far left is of the Reunification Tower, which is on the outskirts of Pyongyang on the road towards the DMZ. The bottom left is of our peace walk in Kaesong, which is that city, that ancient capital that is right north of the DMZ. And then to the bottom right was after we crossed the DMZ into South Korea in Paju, which is in the Gyeonggi province in the southern side of the DMZ. And I like to show this image of this woman, North Korean woman on the upper right in Kaesong, because she and hundreds of North Korean people, mothers and little children and men in tank tops. And, you know, I look at this woman and I think, my gosh, she was probably born in a Korea that was not divided, similar to my parents, but probably born in a Korea that was colonized by Japan. And Japan brutally colonized the Korean Peninsula for 35 years from 1910 to 1945. And that paved the way for Korea's division. So since our DMZ crossing, we have worked very hard to bring together North and South Korean women and international women in our work for peace and an end to the war. So in the upper left is us meeting with North Korean women and international women in Bali, Indonesia. We tried to bring North and South Korean women together. This was in 2016, but you may remember North Korea's last nuclear test, which was a hydrogen bomb, occurred days before we gathered. So the South Korean president at the time, Park Geun-hye, who was ultimately impeached and thrown out of office and imprisoned, threatened the South Korean women if that they went, that they would be imprisoned or fined. We've brought women together in Seoul. In the upper right is in 2018 during the historic summits, really urging President Trump to meet with Kim Jong-un. And then in the bottom right is an image of our gathering of Northeast Asia women, including women from Canada and from the US, but China, Japan, Russia, North and South Korea in Beijing. And in the bottom left is Mi-hyung, who is a peace activist from South Korea. We gathered in Vancouver to urge members of the quote unquote UN command, which were the countries that fought along with the US and South Korea to negotiate peace. In 2019, we launched a women-led peace campaign Korea Peace Now, Women Mobilizing to End the War, along with the Nobel Women's Initiative, WILP, and a coalition of South Korean women's organizations. And we brought together South Korean women peace activists and along with members of parliament to come to Washington, D.C. and meet with women members of Congress. And what we've been doing since is we've been meeting. We meet with, on the upper left is Matthew Pottinger, the National Security Council advisor to Trump. I actually recently met with Kurt Campbell at the White House. Stephen Biegun was the Deputy Secretary of State. Moon Jae-in, who was South Korean president's North Korea advisor. And because Americans, we are banned from traveling to North Korea because of a ban that President Trump instituted in 2017. We can go anywhere in the world. We can go to Afghanistan. We can go to Iran. We can even go to Russia, but we can't go to North Korea. And so I actually had to go to Cambodia to meet the head of the National Peace Committee from North Korea. Part of our organizing is around advancing a peace agreement. We believe that 70 years is too long for Korea to be under a constant state of armistice, and it's time to bring an end to the Korean War. And so we have actually been working with congressional peace champions. The first one was Ro Khanna, the great congressman from California who introduced a bill in 2019 during the period of the summit. And it has now evolved to be an actual House resolution. And the first bill turned into a House resolution, 3446. Brad Sherman, the member of Congress from Southern California, introduced it. And we got 46 co-sponsors in the last Congress. This past,
we're all
yep.
just working to get crushed because it was right above us.
This past March, he reintroduced the bill, which is a very rare thing, apparently. And we now have 35 co-sponsors. Oops, let me go back. We do not have any member of Congress from Colorado supporting this. And we actually have come up with a whip list of potential members of Congress that we think would be sympathetic to this. They're pro-peace, they're progressive, they should be on this list. And so our goal between now and the end of this year is to get 15 members of Congress. And we believe we could get Joe Neguse and Brittany Pettersen to be on this bill. It makes perfect sense. It aligns with their values and their politics. And I know having all of you on tonight's call from Colorado will make the difference. So how we do this is we do it through grassroots people power. And these are a few photos of some of our activities. On the upper left is actually a meeting that we had with a former member of Congress. I'm trying to remember, it was like Perlman or something from Colorado. We met with him. I don't think he's in office anymore, but he was very sympathetic. What was his name?
Ed Perlmutter.
Ed Perlmutter. He was very sympathetic, but I guess it was when he was leaving office. Yes. So, but this was members of the Korea Peace Now Hawaii chapter. On the far left is actually Dorothy Ogle, who Linda Yar is now living with at this retirement home at the Fraser Center in Boulder. And Dorothy Ogle is actually an amazing heroine. Her and her husband, George, were missionaries in South Korea during a US-backed dictatorship and helped really and she was like one of the first Americans to go to North Korea and came back and worked with all these Christian pastors to basically go to North Korea and help Korean American families reunite with their families in North Korea. She is an amazing resource. Please reach out to her and meet her when you're at the Rotary Club goes to the Fraser Center tomorrow. We held a screening of Crossings, which is a documentary film about our women's peace movement in Boulder. So these are some photos from the screening and from campus. We've also screened at the Denver Film Festival. And what we do is we have these advocacy weeks where our constituents meet with our members of Congress and we appeal and urge them to be a signatory to the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. And I love this picture on the upper right, which is with Anne Frisch from Washington, D.C. It was a little Rotary Club gathering. and where we held a congressional press conference that was hosted by Barbara Lee and 2 other members of Congress on the 70th anniversary.
Quanta's in right in the middle.
Oh, great. Yes.
So it's here in the room.
So what I feel we're doing is we're doing education, we're doing organizing, and we're doing advocacy. But what we're ultimately doing is we are changing the narrative on the Korean War. I think that when those of you finally get to watch Crossings, I'll show a little clip at the end. It's on the PBS site now. You'll actually realize that, you know, in the 75 screenings that we and the filmmaker Deanne Borchia-Lim and I have done all around the world, actually, during the pandemic, which is quite a feat, that the primary reaction is, oh my God, I cannot believe that I didn't know anything about the Korean War. I didn't realize the responsibility that our government played in dividing the peninsula, in waging an indiscriminate bombing campaign during the Korean War, where we leveled 80% of North Korean cities, but also how much our government stands in the way to actually realizing peace. And that as a signatory to the ceasefire, the United States has a responsibility to end the war. So these are some of the reports that are on our website, the Women Cross DMZ website, or on the Korea Peace Now website, which I'll share with Jim to share out. But these are some of the things that we do. And I hate to have just all men, you know, kind of affirming the work that we do, but I think it's really important. It's kind of hard to read, but Thomas Quintana, who is the former UN Special Rapporteur on North Korea human rights, he actually says in one of his reports, the governments should listen to Women Cross DMZ and these women. And he says a declaration on peace and development on the Korean Peninsula and a swift resolution of the armistice would create the atmosphere and space needed to further discussions on denuclearization and respect for human rights. Another person in the middle is Dan Leaf. He's a retired general, 3-star general, who was the acting commander of Pacific Command, which is right here at Pearl Harbor in my backyard. And he and I have teamed up, and both Anne and Linda met him in Washington, D.C., and he has now become one of our most ardent advocates calling for a peace agreement to end the Korean War. He served 2 tours for the US forces in Korea and South Korea. And he and I went to go meet Kirk Campbell at the White House to urge President Biden to do the right thing and end the Korean War. And then on the right is Joe Cirincione, who's the former president of Plowshares, who, you know, in working with him for several years, finally convinced him and others in the nuclear disarmament community to recognize that we won't ever get North Korea to denuclearize unless we actually get to peace. And so these are some of the things that we do. We got great coverage for our national mobilization. And I put this op-ed in the USA Today thanks to Linda Yar, who basically made that op-ed happen. So we had great coverage in the Washington Post, NBC News, PBS actually covered our press conference, and I was on Democracy Now! But this is part of what we're trying to do in changing the narrative. And so just a few quick photos from our national mobilization in Washington, D.C. This is after a very rainy and hot and humid march from the White House, where we held a rally, to the Lincoln Memorial alongside the Korean War Memorial. We gathered here for this photo, but on this is some images of our press conference. Here's Congresswoman Barbara Lee from California, who all peace-loving people, especially in the United States, know was the lone courageous voice voting against giving authorization to President Bush to go wage war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And why Barbara Lee is so significant is because her father served in the Korean War, and it was his experience in the Korean War that was the reason why he spoke to Barbara before she made that courageous vote. And he said, there is no good that comes from war. And so it was really meaningful to have Congresswoman Lee host our press conference. This is an image of a photo of us going to the State Department, where we met with senior members of the administration. But we also included AFSC, the humanitarian aid organization that has long provided, vital life-saving humanitarian assistance to North Korea. This is Rick Downs. His father's plane was shot down during the Korean War, and he's still searching for his father's remains. This is General Dan Leaf. This is from the Mennonite Central Committee. But this is Joy Gephardt. She's almost 90 years old, and she was separated from her family during the Korean War. And as she eventually migrated to the US in the 80s and 90s, she started to reach out to North Korea to see if she could be reunited with her family. And she amazingly found her sisters. She tells this heartbreaking story of when she was 16, her neighbor came to their house. She lived in Pyongyang, and he said, the bombs are coming, so we need to leave, you need to leave. And the mom, who had many small children, said, we cannot leave, but will you take my daughter, who was Joy? And she remembered looking back at her mother, and her mother saying, dress warm, eat well, and stay alive. And I will see you after the Korean War, after the war ends. And the war has never ended. And so the sad thing is that even though she was able to find her family and her sisters in North Korea, because of the travel ban, she has not been able to go and see them. And then we brought some amazing youth under the age of 30 from all around the country to participate in our national action. And they went to all 35 of the congressional offices to give them a t-shirt and to thank them for being congressional peace champions. And then in addition to our actions, we also, being that this is a movement that is led by women, we know that there's so much grief and trauma still as a result of this unresolved war. And so we held a community grief ritual. And I had no idea how we would pull this off with 350 people, but this is Do-hee Lee, who is from Jeju Island in South Korea and has been leading these community grief rituals. And it was just a really powerful action. Maybe Anne and Linda, who were there, could speak a little bit to it, but it was just really powerful. We untied these strings, these ribbons. And for many of you that may have gone to the DMZ, it's this thread of writing these messages, our hopes for peace, our hopes for ending the war, our hopes for reuniting families. And so we kind of did this action where we were untying these knots as a way of kind of clearing the chi and helping to bring peace to the Korean people and to the Korean Peninsula. So I know I'm going on way too long, but I wanted to just show a few great quotes from a conference that Linda Yar helped host at George Washington University on the last day of our gathering. We had Bruce Cummings, who is the foremost historian on Korea, speak, but we also centered the stories of the families. So Joy Gephardt and Rick Downs, but also humanitarian aid workers like Dr. Ki Park, who has traveled to North Korea and performed brain surgery alongside North Korean doctors and nurses. And then we had representatives from the military, and also Sig Hecker, who is the foremost nuclear scientist from Los Alamos, now at Stanford, talking about why we need peace to ultimately get to denuclearization. And I'm going to end there by just playing a quick little clip of a documentary film that I will send the link to Jim, that is about our peace movement. And then I will end and we can take questions.
Yes,
Okay, so here it goes. This is one little segment. It's now on PBS.
We're not getting any sound.
Oh no, I don't know what to do about that though. Well, I'll just share the link with Jim and you should, if you can watch it, it would be really fabulous. So I think I'll end right there. I know I spoke for too long. So thank you so much for having me and joining me tonight. And hopefully we can get these two members of Congress from Colorado to be our Congressional Korea Peace Champions. Thank you so much.
Certainly not too long, Christine. That's magnificent. I can listen to you all afternoon. I will open the floor to questions. I've got a whole list myself, but I'll open the floor to questions to anyone. You can just raise your hand either through, because the one question that I would have is, what support are you getting from the people of Korea, both North and South? And is there equal agreement on both sides?
Absolutely. I would say that, in our various meetings with the North Koreans and, even preceding our actual meetings with North Koreans, this peace movement, has been going on for generations, actually. I think Linda knows this well, and Dorothy Ogle, who I wish was able to join this call. There has been a very vibrant movement for peace and reunification in both North and South Korea for a very long time. And unfortunately, South Korea is right now under a very right-wing government, President Yoon Suk-yeol, who won by less than 1% of the vote. He has made some very dangerous moves, not just in terms of changing a very long-standing policy. In 2000, it's called the June 15th, 2000 Joint Declaration, where the leaders of North and South Korea, Kim Dae-jung, who ultimately won the Nobel Peace Prize, he was the first democratically elected president to South Korea, who came from the peace and democracy movement in South Korea. He met with Kim Jong-il, the father of Kim Jong-un, and they negotiated what became a very successful Sunshine Policy, where over 1 million South Koreans actually traveled to North Korea and met North Koreans. But Yoon has changed US or South Korean policy to now basically call for regime change. And that is a very terrifying development. And now North Korea is kind of retaliated by not kind of always putting in quotations the Republic of Korea. And so, unfortunately, because South Korea keeps kind of waffling back and forth between liberal and very conservative administrations, it has been difficult to maintain a certain consistent policy on peace and ultimately reunification. But even if you go back to the agreements that were signed in 2018 between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un, they actually say that it's the wishes of the Korean people to end the Korean War, and that we need to do it through a peace agreement. And unfortunately, President Trump at the time, even though he allegedly wanted to see peace, definitely did not orient US policy towards that end. And so we're in a situation now where North Korea, under the summits that happened between Trump and Kim, and then between Kim and Moon, a lot of concessions were made. So when you hear the Americans, when you hear the Biden administration say, we're ready to talk anywhere, anytime, we have an open door policy. Well, the problem is that the North Koreans view that to be very disingenuous, that they made lots of concessions during the Trump administration. They held a self-imposed moratorium for many years where they didn't conduct any nuclear weapons tests or long-range missiles. But unfortunately, after the failure of the Hanoi talks, they basically gave the US a deadline to say, you have to change the US policy Otherwise, we are going back to resuming testing so that they could be nuclear and long-range missile capable. So it's just created a very dangerous situation where, the Korean Peninsula is basically a tinderbox. And what's making things even worse is the situation between the US and China. So back to your question, Jim, absolutely. The Korean people want an end to this war. It's reflected in the leaders and in the various agreements that have been signed between the two Koreas since the 1990s.
Any other questions from the audience? And Bob, I know you're sitting there with several.
I think there's a question from, Bob, we can't hear you.
Bob Sturkle, we can't hear you.
Oh, thank you.
And then
For our approaching our representatives, what have become the primary concerns or objections to moving towards this peace agreement?
I would say that the primary objections that we tend to hear is that peace is a concession to North Korea. And as those of us know, peace is not a concession. It is actually the smart and practical thing. And in fact, Dan Leith, who is the former, who's the retired lieutenant general, who has actually become one of our most effective, weapons in our peace toolbox. He says we are one accident away from nuclear war. And, we helped him write this op-ed. I'll put it in the chat in the New York Times. It's called, I Know How Nuclear War is Waged, and It's Time for Peace with North Korea. And what Dan says, is we have no options, really. If we're one accident away from a nuclear war, and we have to do what is right, which is what our military commanders promised to do 70 years ago. And when he published this op-ed in the New York Times, which I helped him pitch to an editor that I've long worked with, he wrote me and said, it's finally going to be published. He said, 20 years ago, I was the senior pilot going to bomb Baghdad. And now I'm so happy to be working for peace. So we have people from the military, we have people from the humanitarian aid community, we have the former UN Special Rapporteur on North Korea human rights. We have so many voices calling for a new US policy that doesn't depend on the same failed approach, which is provocative military exercises, sanctions which harm the people, and just isolating North Korea. This has not worked. And in fact, it's an ever more dangerous situation because of COVID, because North Korea has been in lockdown and further isolated. And, I think that many of you may have seen the news that Kim Jong-un plans to meet Putin in the coming weeks, that Russia is trying to enlist North Korea in sending arms to Russia because they're all sides. So we know that South Korea has actually sent arms to Ukraine via the US and Poland, which is in contravention to South Korean national policy because they don't want to be involved in any kind of existing conflict. But they were strong-armed by the US, by Biden, to send weapons to Ukraine. And so I think, we can stop this. But US policy is just further pushing North Korea into an alliance with China and Russia. And it's not that that's what the North Koreans want, but basically they have no other choice. And I think that's where peace and a new approach could actually turn the tide and could be a real game changer, I think, because it wasn't, the US-China conflict, it actually finds its origins in the Korean War, because it wasn't just the US with these 17 other countries. China fought alongside North Korea. And so it was the first war, actually, the Korean War, where US and Chinese troops fought each other. And so imagine what we could do to reverse the tide in the US-China great power competition if we could see an end to the Korean War and peace on the Korean Peninsula.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Christine.
Two questions, Joan, three questions, Joan, then Denton, and then Bob Maroney. Joan?
Okay. Yes, thank you very much, Christine, for an excellent overview. I was thinking about South Korea. Are there nuclear weapons stationed in South Korea at this time? I assume there are, but you don't really ever hear about that. Could you clarify that for me?
Yes, Joanne, so great to see you. And South Korea, the US had nuclear weapons in South Korea kind of in secret from 1956 up until the early 1990s under George Bush Sr. And so they finally removed them. But now, under the new agreement between the US and South Korea, the Biden administration sent 2 nuclear capable submarines to be docked in South Korea. So technically they are under the US nuclear umbrella, but now the US has actually returned after how many years, almost 4 decades, nuclear weapons back to South Korea.
Thank you.
Richard?
Thank you very much, Jim, and great to see you, Christine, once again. I'm in Canada, so what can other countries other than the US do to promote signing of this peace accord between the two Koreas?
Thanks so much, Richard. Well, as you know, Canada was the second largest country after the United States in sending troops to the Korean War. And so we have long held the position that all the countries that participated in the Korean War have a responsibility to help bring closure to it. And that very much includes Canada. And so we, through the Nobel Women's Initiative, engaged the Canadian government, Prime Minister Trudeau's administration, and unfortunately, because Canada tends to just toe the US line, was hard to get much progress there. But if you can, obviously, with the peace community, with the nuclear disarmament community, really keep pushing for Canada to do the right thing and, call for an end to the Korean War with replacing the armistice with the peace agreement, that would be really terrific. But yeah, it's so, we have only so many hours in the day and resources that, we just feel like, gosh, the US is the big player here. And we need to, very few other countries, the UK or Canada, Australia, will move unless the US moves.
Bob Maroney?
Yes, could you tell us or suggest what top 3 concessions the US and its allies and South Korea would have to make to satisfy North Korea? And what top 3 concessions do you think North Korea is going to have to make to get the ball rolling?
That's a really great question, Bob. I would say probably the top 3 concessions that the US and South Korea will have to make are around the military exercises. I would say that's a very principled demand from the from the North Korean side, is to halt those military exercises, which include in its operational plans a regime change and overthrow of the North Korean regime in Pyongyang. It would have to be doing away with the sanctions, that are harming the North Korean people and further isolating and preventing the North Korean government from engaging in the global economy. And I would say third is and I'm just speaking for myself, but I think, 70 years on, and especially with the economic crisis that we face in this country and a forever war, endless war that the US has been involved in, which includes the Korean War, that we have to see the withdrawal ultimately of US troops from the Korean Peninsula. We still have 28,500 troops in South Korea. And just seems to me that that will have to ultimately be negotiated. Now, I hesitate to say that because that is oftentimes an argument that is put forth by those who oppose peace, that North Korea is demanding the withdrawal of US troops from the Korean Peninsula, when in fact, that isn't the case. And actually, there's plenty of evidence where the North Korean leaders, from Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il to now Kim Jong-un, have said that the US troops can stay, that they actually see the presence of the US on the Korean Peninsula as an important counterbalance to China's increasing role and prominence in the region. North Korea will have to begin a process to denuclearize, which was very much on the table in the Hanoi summits or in the summits between Kim and Trump. And I think the other issue that has long been a concern is the human rights situation in North Korea. So I would say those are probably the three issues that North Korea will have to address in the peace process and negotiations. But I would say, let's try to negotiate a peace in order to even get to some of those thornier issues. But it's a great question, Bob.
Thank you.
What I'm hearing is there is a mixed relationship with China and North Korea.
Yes, it is. It's a very mixed relationship. And it was an interesting thing, and I know this is being recorded, but to sit across from Kurt Campbell and explain to him that it is in our national interest to negotiate peace with North Korea in our efforts vis-a-vis China. The US is obviously trying to line up its allies to further contain a growing and rising China. But what I communicated to Mr. Campbell was the North Koreans may despise US imperialism, but they also want their sovereignty, and they don't want China's overreach. And right now, the way that it is they have, China is their largest economic trading partner. They are a lifeline to the North Koreans. And so,
Hey guys.
And the truth is that, if there was a regime change in North Korea, which has been very much driving US policy on this issue, on this conflict, is the presumption that the North Korean regime will collapse at any time. And it just frankly hasn't. And I think it's a fantasy to assume that it will. But were that to be the case, I think it's important to remember that it's not South Korea or the US that will go into North Korea. It will be China. China, which has a mutual defense treaty with the DPRK, which conducts joint exercises with North Korea. It is, I think, a pipe dream to assume that the US and South Korea would be the ones that would go into North Korea. I mean, not to be so hard geopolitical about the situation, but it makes sense from a humanitarian perspective. It makes sense from a political perspective, but it also makes sense in terms of US national interests. And so that's what we're facing, is just incredible misinformation and ignorance on North Korea that is so much part of the narrative about North Korea that is fed to us by Hollywood and the military industrial complex. And I think it's a real detriment to not just the Korean people, but to us as Americans in the United States. I think, when we think about the period of the 20th anniversary of the US war on terror, between that and the beginning of the Ukraine war, I mean, I just think, my God, we were so close. Chuck Schumer, even Senator Schumer, was one of 20 members of the Senate that voted for a massive reduction in the Pentagon budget. And now we're approaching almost $1 trillion. Where do you think we will ever be able to have the resources to build a just and sustainable society at home? We have to end our forever war policy, and the Korean War is the oldest of these wars.
So that we could speak with one voice, would you have a sample letter that we could send to our congressman and senator?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely, Jim. I will forward that on to you with a just one-page fact sheet that Women Cross TMZ has produced with AFSC, the American Friends Service Committee, which I will forward to you. And it would be amazing if you could garner a bunch of signatures. And also, there are many people in the Denver metropolitan Boulder area that are allies of ours, which also include Dorothy Rupert, that Linda was mentioning, who was the former local official from Boulder, an amazing heroine. And Miyok Fowler, who is a Korean American, former Korean Studies professor at University of Colorado. There are lots of people that are not on this call that are very much with us from the Korean American community, but also the broader progressive community, peace community in the area. And in fact, one of our board members of Women Cross DMZ is Marie Berry. I'm not sure if many of you know her. She's kind of a local star, but
Yes,
she is a great feminist scholar, anti-war scholar, and she runs the Sioux Center
DU.
at Denver University. She's on our board of Women Cross TMZ. And I just want to share this little story that really touched my heart. When we went to Denver to screen Crossings, she started by introducing me and the film. And then she actually said, her last name is Berry, but that's actually not her biological grandfather, her biological name. It's actually a step grandfather. And it turns out that her grandfather flew 81 bombing missions to North Korea. And he came back. He was so traumatized and damaged from that war that he waged horrific violence against her grandmother and her father, who was 6 years old at the time, that they had to flee. And her grandmother remarried, and that's how she got the name Berry. And I find it so poignant that she speaks to how even she didn't even know this history, but the ways in which the Korean War has so touched our lives and American lives, not just Korean lives, but actually American lives, and all the kind of generations of trauma and abuse and violence and drug addiction and all sorts of other health problems that resulted from her grandfather basically fighting in the Korean War. Like, we just have no idea of the long legacy. And, to Koreans on the peninsula and in the diaspora, it is the singular trauma that has impacted Korean people's lives. And so I think, it's so important to do this knowing that it's the right thing for Korean people, but it's the right thing for us here in the United States to see the responsibility of our government in the division of Korea and, the participating, the leading country in waging the war with South Korea, but also in ending it. I think, yeah. And John German said, how can we help? And please send the link. And I will follow up with Jim after this webinar to send all this information, because I know that with the Rotarians in Colorado, that we can get these members of Congress. I'm so confident that we could do this. It's just, I feel like Joe Neguse is very primed and we just need to get him over the hump. And I know very much that this community can do it.
And we have a question from Quanta, Don Light.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful. I'm really glad that I got to hear you more in detail, Christine. One thing that you have mentioned, and I'm glad that you have mentioned, it's the military-industrial complex and its stranglehold on our legislators. This is a fact. But I think what we need to do is to really reach out to the general American public so that they understand the connection between the military expenditure and their lack of, for instance, they send billions of dollars to Ukraine, but a couple of million or maybe 7 million to Hawaii, where there was a horrendous fire. I mean, this is a slap in the face to the American people. So I think they need to see the connection, because our culture is, so what is in it for me? How does this affect me? We have to get that message out so that they understand when the military expenditure is reduced, when we have peace, then their needs are going to be met more adequately by the legislators passing fairer laws for healthcare, for education. So I just wanted to bring that up, and hopefully you guys are such wonderful leaders, and then come together, coalesce all these beautiful, wonderful organizations and consolidate your power so that we can really make a change, an effective change. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your presentation.
Oh, thank you so much, Quanta. And you're right there. I mean, imagine if the way that you think and your analysis, just even 1% of Americans actually understood that. And I think actually more Americans probably agree with that, that very basic concept that we actually could do so much better for America and for Americans if we weren't engaged in these forever wars. So I'm absolutely in agreement with you, and that we have to see the linkages between our domestic policies and our foreign policies. And that if we could actually shift our foreign policy away from forever wars and militarization, that actually it could do dramatic things to improve our security at home. We have to get out of the national security paradigm that is so much shaped and driven by the military-industrial complex. We need ordinary people like us that are weighing in on US foreign policy. And so that's why this Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act has been a very important educational tool that we have used, because the members of Congress, that is our direct line to the United States government. They represent us. And so that's why we have to practice democracy. And it's sadly one of the only avenues. Yes, we can keep engaging the Biden administration, the State Department, but really they're not going to act unless there's actual real pressure. Nobody knows pain more than our elected officials. So we kind of need to put the heat and the pressure on. And so this is a very small thing that we can do, but imagine the symbolic importance of ending America's oldest war, the most brutal war, and what that could do to reverse the massive militarization. And I know I'm running out of time, but Bruce Cummings, who is the historian who gave the keynote speech at the conference at George Washington University that Linda helped host, he often says that it was the Korean War that inaugurated the military-industrial complex, that in those 3 years, we quadrupled defense spending. We set forth the US to become the world's military police. And so it's not just a symbolic gesture of ending the war, but imagine what that could do to reverse the massive militarization that we are experiencing here in this country. which I think is manifesting in many ways, whether it's the trauma of our veterans returning from endless forever wars to, the massive arms and gun problem that we are facing in this country. I think we have to make the connections between our forever war policies and the violence that we experience on a day-to-day basis.
If one other quick question, I don't see any other hands. All of us that are working in peace, for peace have run into stone walls occasionally with people and are shocked and appalled at the people that fight against us working for peace. What are some of the challenges that you have run into, if you can be brief?
Let's see if I can find this. So I want to read this quote. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily from him, but Gandhi says that, or it's attributed to Gandhi, that first they ignore you, then they make fun of you, then they fight you, and then you win. And I feel like we're in a situation where I'm going to just find this really quickly. There is an oligarch. Her name is Annie Chan, and she's Korean American, believe it or not. She was married to a Taiwanese American guy who they met here at the University of Hawaii, and he made billions selling semiconductor chips. Anyway, they've divorced now, but she is so wealthy that she is underwriting all the opposition to us. And so actually 2 weeks ago, I was tipped to this ad. I don't know if you can see it.
Yes.
Yeah, it says Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, alluring but dangerous. And it actually lists me as a pro-North Korean individual. And you couldn't, I mean, she spent over $10,000 putting this ad in the local paper here, in the Sunday paper. And there's just a part of me that's like, oh my God. Like, I mean, Kanta, you mentioned about the US like sending all this to Ukraine as Lahaina in Maui was just burning. But I mean, this is a woman that's based here in Hawaii, and she's spending over $10,000 to run these ads to spread fake news. And Eli Clifton of the Quincy Institute did a great investigative reporting piece about Annie Chan. And she's actually on the board of something called Allied Nuclear. And if you actually go and Google that, and then you look at their board, it's all these retired US military defense officials. And what they're trying to do is trying to get South Korea to build its own nuclear weapons program. So she has a personal profit and motivation in maintaining this Korean conflict. And so, yeah, so Jim, that's what we're up against. We're up against very well-financed and resourced interests that are calling our effort for peace on the Korean Peninsula as either a phony peace movement, as one op-ed in the Wall Street Journal noted, to calling us pro-North. And unfortunately, that Cold War McCarthyist tactic has never ended on the Korean Peninsula. And
Christine?
we have to fight against that. Yeah.
I'll end with the story that I learned in the retail business. I had a retail business for 20 some years of some size. And I was several years into the business before I started hearing people saying negative things about my business. And it was the wise ones that explained to me if they're not talking about you, you're not hurting anything. So the fact that they're talking about you is a positive sign that you're making a difference. It's hard to accept, but the more they talk about you, the more it's an indication that you're making a difference, that you're moving up there. And the closer we get the cats into the corner, the harder they come out fighting, but we will keep on going. Wow, Christine, I can't thank you enough. And if you would send me the letter, and I will forward it to anybody of interest, and I'll forward it to anybody anyway, whether they want it or not. Let's get this done and see if we can't start a movement. This is exciting. We thank you for sharing your extensive knowledge and very thought-provoking, stimulating, educationally, and inspiring. So next month, we're eager to introduce you to a new and exciting program between Rotary and the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at the George Mason University. I'm excited about this as it will be moving peace studies from theory and classroom into the field is what we're trying to do. We will have two presenters, Charles Davidson, who is the Director of Political Leadership Academy at the George Mason, who will be leading the new program. Also, the Rotary presenter is Larry Cooler, among many other things, a fellow at the Brookings Institute. In-depth information on each will be coming for you to each month. Christine, again, we are so thankful and gracious for what you do. And with that, we bid good evening to all.